This Week in Primetime on C-SPAN, cspan.org, and on the free C-SPAN radio app.
Washington Journal continues.
It was this past April where the House Speaker Paul Ryan took to the podium and announced his resignation. Here's part of that announcement.
You realize something when you take this job. It's a big job with a lot riding on you, and you feel it. But you also know that this is a job that does not last forever. You realize that you hold the office for just a small part of our history, so you better make the most of it. It's fleeting, and that inspires you to do big things. And on that score, I think we have achieved a heck of a lot.
There's no more. And with that announcement, our next guest says, comes an opportunity. He is Bill Galston with the group No Labels. Good morning.
Morning, Pedro.
Talk a little bit about the opportunity that you see here in light of that announcement.
Well, there is going to be a vacancy in the speakership. And there's going to be a midterm election in November, which will, in all probability, leave the two parties in the House of Representatives pretty evenly balanced. If the Democrats have a majority, it's not going to be a big one. If the Republicans retain their majority, it's not going to be by much. In these circumstances, a relatively small band of determined reformers can help get Congress back on track. Right now, the Congress of the United States is the dysfunctional branch of our constitutional system. It is broken. It is not doing its job. It can't do its job. And the reasons for that go beyond the polarization and discord between the two political parties. They have to do with antique, obsolete rules for conducting its business that make it almost impossible to get the people's work done. And we at No Labels are out to change that.
And so with a project known as the Speaker Project, a little bit that folks can find it online, what is this project then in light of what you just said?
Well, it is a way of turning the speakership, the only constitutional House office, that is the only House office mentioned in the Constitution, the speakership into an office that serves the entire House of Representatives. So the Speaker of the House is the Speaker of the entire House and not just the majority leader. It's also a way of empowering minorities in the House of Representatives to make their voices heard. Obviously, they can't overpower the majority, but at least they'd have a fair chance to have their voices heard. It's also, interestingly, a way of empowering the Speaker to act more effectively to put together bipartisan majorities. I could go into details, but these are some of the objectives. We have lots of other proposals as well, including punishing members of the House and Senate who don't get the budget done on time, including requiring members of the House and Senate actually to work 5-day work weeks when they're in session. These are all common sense proposals that we think would make the Congress of the United States a lot stronger.
But let's start at the beginning then.
Sure. Let's
say there's a new Congress, let's say a party's going to be in power, a new speaker is elected, whether it be Republicans or Democrats. What's the one thing that could change right off the bat that would promote more bipartisanship?
Stick with me for just a minute, because this is a little bit complicated and involves a little bit of history. But the beginning is that the House of Representatives reinvents itself every 2 years. Unlike the Senate, it doesn't have rules that grow on from 1 year to the next. Every 2 years, the House gets together and organizes itself, and it organizes itself by electing a speaker and passing a package of rules that will govern its behavior. Now, what you need to know about the election of the speaker as things now stand is that you need a majority, 218 out of 435. What happens if a handful of determined reformers from the majority party say, we're not going to vote for our party's nominee for speaker unless at the same time we pass a package of rules reforms? No reform, no votes. No votes, no speaker. And we can't get off the starting line. This sounds like a fantasy, but there are two reasons why it isn't. Number one, it's happened before. Almost a century ago, in 1925, The Republicans, in 1922, the Republicans lost most of their House majority, but still had a narrow majority. And a small group of reform Republicans said to the leaders of their own party, we're not going to vote for our party's nominee for Speaker unless you agree to these rules changes. And they went 9 votes, no majority, and finally the leadership caved and agreed to the reform. And we have a bipartisan caucus. We started a bipartisan caucus in the House of Representatives called the Problem Solvers, now an independent bipartisan caucus, an official caucus, 24 Democrats, 24 Republicans. Whoever has a narrow majority after the November election, our people are determined to withhold their votes until there's serious reform.
If those new rules have to be passed, then what's chief among those rules that would, again, promote bipartisanship and end gridlock as you see it?
Well, I guess first and foremost among them is a change in the way the Speaker is elected. Rather than a simple majority, which could be one party only, our proposal is that in order to become Speaker, you need a vote total equal to the number of votes the majority has plus 5. What that means is that the next Speaker will have to reach out to at least some members of the minority party. That will make the Speaker, that will bring the Speaker closer to being the Speaker of the House and not just the majority leader. And that matters because the Speaker is third in line to the presidency. If a plane, with terrorists crashes into the White House and the president and the vice president are both killed, the Speaker becomes president. We need someone who enjoys broad-based support and legitimacy. So that's the beginning, but we have a lot of other proposals. Here's the next one. Okay, once we have a strong bipartisan Speaker in place, that Speaker should not have a sword of Damocles hanging over his head. And there now is such a sword in the form of something called a motion to vacate that any one member of the House of Representatives can propose, and for an up or down vote. And it takes precedence over just about everything else in the House. A Speaker in living memory, John Boehner, was driven out of office because one person filed a motion to vacate against him with a small group of dissidents behind him, and that was enough to get John Boehner to throw in the towel.
That was Mark Meadows, if I remember
Yes,
correctly.
exactly. And you can't have a Speaker who's trying to do the people's business across party lines with that kind of sword over his head, so that a minority of his own party can depose him. We also want to make it easier for majorities that cross party lines to be able to express themselves. And right now there's a mechanism called the Discharge Petition. And if you get 218 votes, you can bring a bill to the floor even if the Speaker doesn't like it. The problem is you have to do it in broad daylight.
So we'll pause just a second there.
Yeah.
I want our viewers to get in on the conversation, especially if you want to hear more and ask our guests questions about this idea of ending gridlock in Congress, particularly with the onset of a new Speaker coming in. If you want to ask them questions, Democrats, it's 202-748-8000. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Independents, 202-748-8002. You can post thoughts on Twitter at C-SPAN-WJ, and you can also post on our Facebook feed at facebook.com/C-SPAN. Go ahead.
So, in a number of instances in recent years, there have been majorities in favor of bipartisan legislation to address some of the country's most urgent problems. But the speakers of the House have taken the position that they want to pass legislation with the votes of the majority only. And so they have refused to bring to the floor bills that enjoyed broad bipartisan support. We don't think the American people really want the House of Representatives to work that way. We think if there's a popular majority across party lines, then the House of Representatives ought to allow that majority's proposal to come to the floor for a vote. It's very, very simple. And what we want to do is make it easier for a bipartisan majority.
You talk about that, and you talked about those problem solvers.
Yeah.
But isn't the real power in the House currently held on factions such as the House Freedom Caucus and the Tuesday Group and all those other things? And doesn't that affect the ability for people to come towards the middle, or at least come to some agreement on certain things so that bipartisanship can be done?
It certainly does, and we don't think that a minority of the majority ought to be able to run the House of Representatives. As a matter of fact, the founders were worried about the tyranny of the majority. Well, they didn't know how bad it could get. They couldn't imagine the tyranny of the majority, and they certainly couldn't imagine the tyranny of the majority, but that's where we are now, and it's crazy because it means that the American people's business isn't getting done, and we want to change that.
As far as the project itself, and again, you can find it online at the No Labels website. That's nolabels.org/rules if you want to see more there. Have you had a chance to talk with, aside from the problem solvers themselves, how much play is this getting, or how much interest is it getting outside of that group?
Well, the fact that there have been 2 national articles in national newspapers in the past couple of weeks has attracted people's attention. We know that the leadership in both political parties are paying attention to this. And as you might imagine, they have mixed views on the subject because this would change the rules of the game. And the leadership of the 2 political parties have been playing according to the old rules for a very long time. They know how to play according to those rules. They're a little bit worried about the changes. So if this happens, it would be from below and not top down. But of course, that's the way our government's supposed to work, isn't it?
Republicans hold the power currently. How willing do you think Democrats would be if they took the House after November elections to come to this conclusions and to at least follow the rules as you set them out?
Well, I go back almost 100 years to 1923. The Republicans had the majority after the elections of 1922, and obviously the leadership and a lot of other Republicans preferred to do things the old way, but the reformers said no. We have to change the rules of the game, and they prevailed. So there's going to be some resistance, obviously, because all change evokes resistance and fear and anxiety. This will too, but does anybody think that the way the Congress of the United States is now functioning is the best we can do? Does anybody think it's a healthy situation when only 17% of the American people approve of the way Congress is doing its business? This is a public outcry for change, and we're just trying to respond.
We'll take some calls for Bill Galston of No Labels. Also, he serves at the Brookings Institution to talk about the Speaker Project. Let's start in Wyoming. Republican line, this is Gordon. You're on with Bill Galston. Go ahead.
Good morning. 2 quick questions. On Book TV, there was a book called How to Turn Republicans and Democrats into Americans. I don't know much about it. I was wondering if you folks might. And Pedro, we were talking once a year or 2 ago about incomes raising or lowering, and you happened to ask me what my income was. I'm a little curious what yours is. Thanks.
Let's go to Steve. Steve is in Ohio, Independent Line. You're on with Bill Galston to talk about the Speaker Project. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for taking my call. No matter what rules you come up with, they're no better than the people behind them. Why not take the money out from the standpoint that these people, when they leave Congress, whether it be Senate or the House, have to take the money that's in their reelection campaign, which is usually millions of dollars, and rather than going in their pocket, have to turn it over to the party that they run with. Therefore, there would not be this great incentive with regard to these people leaving just when they should stay there, like rats leaving a ship.
Mr. Galston.
Well, you actually said something very interesting that I don't think James Madison would agree with, and that is that the government is no better than the people in it. In fact, the whole point of our Constitution is to take people as we find them, and frequently what we find isn't all that great, and use the incentives of the rules of and institutions in order to get them to act more consistently with the public interest. And so what we're proposing very simply is giving people stronger incentives to do the right thing. Now, would our job be easier if the people who were elected to Congress were all angels? Absolutely. But as James Madison famously said, that if all men were angels, government would be unnecessary. So yes, it would be wonderful if people were purely motivated by the public good and not by private gain. And I personally am in favor of lots of measures that would try to reduce the incentives for private gain in our political system. But there are a lot of obstacles to doing that, and No Labels is choosing a different reform avenue. There are lots of people working on money in politics. We're one of the few groups working on changing the rules of the game.
Just a little bit then about No Labels for those who may not be familiar with it.
Yes, absolutely. No Labels is a genuinely nonpartisan, or should I say tripartisan group at the grassroots level and in the Congress. Our members include Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We are not a third party. We are not a third party in the making. We are a classic American reform group that is trying to take the problems as we find them and organize citizens and elected officials across party lines to help our government function better so that it can do the people's business. It's as simple as that. We've been in existence for about 10 years. We've scored some successes, some singles and doubles. With the Speaker Project, we're swinging for the fences.
From Florida on our independent line, Terry, hi there.
Hey, good morning, Mr. Pedro and Mr. Galston. Thank you for taking my call. I just want to first of all make a commend you guys for the work that you do, especially C-SPAN and you too, Mr. Galston. I love it when C-SPAN have on your show your people who think proactive, pragmatic, and strategically, like Mr. Galston is proposing. My first question is, what do you think about legislation and a government that governs by consensus and referendum? And the second question is real quick. What about that constitutional clause where it says trying to make a more perfect union? I think that's the premise behind everything that you're doing, Mr. Galston. And thanks again, and happy 4th of July.
Well, same to you. And first of all, I join with you in being grateful for C-SPAN. It's one of a kind. I've been on C-SPAN many times, and I've gotten some tough questions, but it is the ultimate fair news organization. With regard to your questions, I have my doubts about government by referendum. I think there's a good reason why the founders didn't write such a provision into the Constitution, although, as you know, many states have referenda. Here's the problem. A referendum puts a proposition on the table. You can't amend it. The public can't amend it. It either has to say yes or no. And very frequently, referenda are phrased ambiguously or imperfectly, and there's no opportunity to make them better. I'm in favor of ordinary legislation through the normal process. One of the problems right now is that the House of Representatives is more like government by referendum, where most amendments are not permitted, and both the majority and the minority are confronted with take it or leave it propositions. So we now have the worst of both worlds. We have a legislature that functions like a referendum, and we at No Labels are in favor of turning the legislature back into a legislative body where people who have ideas can put them forward in the form of amendments and have them considered fairly. Obviously, you can't open the door to complete chaos with 435,000 people, but you can certainly have a much fairer and more open process than we do now.
In fact, part of the Speaker Project solutions when it comes to more representation from the minority party includes 3 plans: fair notice for all bills, and opening for amendments, and representation on the Rules Committee.
Right.
You can highlight those, but can't say you brought up amendments. Couldn't that be turned into a political divisive tool? Because if a bill comes forward, the other party doesn't like it, open amendments. They add a bunch of amendments to slow down the process. That's something of a good thing can be turned into a bad thing.
Look, there are no perfect rules. But right now, we have a radically unbalanced system where most bills of any consequence come to the floor in the House of Representatives with what's known as a closed rule. So you can't offer any amendments. It's there as a take it or leave it proposition. And that's a problem in itself. When you add to that the fact that a lot of the committees that used to be where legislation was drafted have now had their power drained away into the leadership, so bills are actually written in the leaders' chambers, and then committees are just rubber stamps. There's a double deprivation of opportunity to make ideas better through the amendment process, first in the committees and then secondly on the House floor. And let me put it this way. If you're satisfied with the results of the rules as they are now operating, then No Labels, has nothing to offer you. If you happen to think that a body with 17% public support that has a very hard time, even, matter of fact, hasn't done a budget on time for years, let alone more ambitious, forward-leaning legislation, if you happen to think that's a problem, then we have a solution.
Then to your point, then, say if you talked about the budget, what's the role of an appropriations committee now as far as you see it currently, and how could that be changed under what you're proposing under these new rules?
Well, look, right now we have a situation where the appropriations bills don't get done in time. And so what you have at the end of the fiscal year, or usually well into the next fiscal year, you have what's called, an omnibus bill. Those of us who are with gray hair and memories remember when Ronald Reagan, came to the well, for a State of the Union address, the well of the House, with an omnibus appropriations bill this high, and he said, "I'm never going to sign another one of these again." Well, president after president has been forced to sign those bills over the past 30 some odd years since Ronald Reagan said that, because the House of Representatives and the Congress as a whole have just defaulted on their most basic responsibility to do a budget for the next fiscal year on time so that the government can function according to that budget.
Let's hear from a Republican line. This is Montana. Jim is there. Hi, Jim. Go ahead.
Good morning. I get tired of the label dysfunctional Congress, because I see Congress as performing exactly as the founders designed it. We have a small group of people wanting to fundamentally change America, and Congress has locked down that change. I see it performing exactly as it should, and I don't see it as dysfunction when we're not moving what the guest is referring to as forward. Thank you.
Mr. Galston.
Well, I guess you represent the 17% of the American people who are satisfied with the way the House of Representatives and the Congress are now functioning, and I can certainly see that from your standpoint, one of the most essential functions of Congress is to prevent bad things from happening. And there's a lot to what you're saying. But I think you would probably agree with me that it's not good government if the government doesn't have a budget to function by. And it's been years since the government of the United States has begun its fiscal year with an approved budget for the entire government. And so from the standpoint of what the founders created the Congress of the United States to do, its most essential power is the power of the purse. That is the way the Congress of the United States does its constitutional bit to steer the activities of the government. And if it's not doing even that, then I think we have a problem.
From Florida, Alvin is next. Independent line. Good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Galston, I think you are a trender, and you're doing what exactly needs to be done for change. I'm disturbed by Congress, and I'm 55 years old, and nothing's ever been done, really. I just say, well, what president has done what Congress has done what? And it's all status quo, and it's the same. I believe teachers should make way more than congressmen. Everybody talk about the founders. That was great. That was a stepping stone. But to me, for change, the Constitution needs to be changed. You should work on that also, because the Constitution was written back way when. Times have changed. We don't live like we've lived back when it was made. So it needs changing, and you're doing a good job. I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you for those comments. It is true that the Constitution was written a long time ago. It's also true that it has been amended more than two dozen times since it was adopted. So there are mechanisms for change that don't involve ripping up the document and starting all over again. And you may well be right that it is time to consider well-judged new constitutional amendments to address some of the structural problems that we've now discovered with our government system. The problem, of course, is to come up with proposals that can get the support of people in 3/4 of the states. That isn't easy. It's certainly possible, though, and I know some friends of mine are thinking hard about some basic constitutional amendments, and I think they'll certainly stir up conversation, even if they don't get their way.
Recently on this program, we had Democratic Representative Tom Suozzi, and he is the vice chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus on Capitol Hill. He talked about the influence that him and others like him get on Capitol Hill currently, or at least the perspective he has on it. I want you to listen a little bit of what he had to say and get your perspective.
The problem is that small groups of people are controlling the debate, which finds the Republicans moving further to the right because they want to please their primary base, and the Democrats moving further to the left because they want to please their primary base, and nobody doing anything in the middle. And we're not going to solve the problems in this country unless people stop yelling and screaming at each other and they start working together to try and find common sense solutions in the middle. That's not happening because of gerrymandering, safe seats, people being pulled to the extremes away from each other.
So even as he says, Mr. Galston, this idea of pulling to the extremes on Capitol, and how do you change that fundamentally?
Well, you change that fundamentally by creating a situation in which bipartisan majorities, which do exist, are allowed to have a voice in the legislative process. I know for a fact that in one of the most disputed issues, namely immigration reform, for at least a decade, there has been a bipartisan majority in both the House and the Senate in favor of change that I think, based on survey research, would enjoy broad public support. And the rules of the game have prevented that legislation from being enacted. And I could go through a number of other areas that have exactly the same problem. So Tom, as always, is a man of common sense, and I think he's just said what many of us believe and what many Americans believe.
On the immigration side, we saw this threat of a discharge petition take place. It led to at least an attempt to pass legislation to no avail. What do you think then about the power of the discharge petition that you spoke about, and especially how it was applied these last couple of weeks?
Well, it's a very good example of what's wrong with the current system, because the discharge petition would have permitted votes on a wide range of immigration proposals, including genuinely bipartisan proposals. Instead, the Speaker of the House, to prevent those bipartisan proposals from coming to the floor, exerted a lot of pressure to prevent 216 members who had signed that discharge petition from getting the number that they required, which was 218. And what he did was permit two bills to come to the floor for votes. Both of them were Republican-only bills, never negotiated across party lines. And the Republican Party, it turns out, doesn't have a majority in favor of an approach to immigration when it tries to do the job by itself. So it was a total disaster. And if the discharge petition had been had been done the way we're proposing, namely anonymously, so that representatives don't have to risk their political careers if they defy their leadership, we would have had a wider range of bills to consider, and I guarantee you at least one of them would have gotten a majority.
The discharge petition is just one of those ideas in the Speaker Project that's available at the No Labels website. Bill Galston, one of the driving forces behind that. He with that group, also with the Brookings Institution. Again, you can find his thoughts online and more about the Speaker Project. From Tennessee, Republican line, this is Alex.
Yes, Mr. Galston. Interesting. Been watching you for about 30 years up here on C-SPAN. It's been great watching you as you've grown older and some of your views have changed. I certainly haven't aged, I can tell, but you've always been a bit of a liberal, and I like the way you think. My 2 cents as a Republican is that I like the slow process that the Constitution established. I don't want our legislators to be able to make a lot of decisions quickly. I want them to go nice and slow. As far as some of the recent decisions over you just mentioned the immigration issue. I don't think there ever has been a time when the Democrats were in charge, they had their way and they blocked everything the Republicans wanted. Now the Republicans are in charge, and they're going to block everything the Democrats want. It's just the way the ball bounces. And what do you say about that? How do you feel about that?
Well, what you just said, sir, is a very fair description of the past 20 years. But I suspect, listening to your voice, that you and I are both of an age, especially if you've been watching me for 30 years, God save me. And we can both remember a time when it wasn't like this, when, despite party differences, that the two parties were able to get together on important legislation. I'll give you an example from a Republican administration, Ronald Reagan's presidency, when Democrats and Republicans got together on genuine tax reform. That was a bipartisan effort from start to finish. It wasn't easy. It fulfilled your definition of a good legislative process. It was very slow. It took a long time, but it produced a result that was really good for the country. And I would submit that we would be better off if we could find our way back to a time more than 20 years ago, 30 or 40 years ago, when the political parties played hardball with each other, but at the end of the day, they were able to agree on something that promoted the public interest.
To that vein, Mr. Galston, to talk about a modern day story, the next Supreme Court nomination, and what do you expect as far as activities of the Senate on this process? What does history tell you about a president who has a second chance of nominating someone to the court?
Oh, history says all sorts of things, and the current president, President Trump, is a very fortunate man because he is getting his second nomination to the Supreme Court in as many years in office. And I very much hope that he will come up with a nominee who doesn't provoke a terrible fight in the Congress and in the country. I'm a realist. I know that President Trump is going to select someone who practices conservative jurisprudence, as conservatism in jurisprudence is now defined. That's fine. And if there were a Democratic president, a different set of standards would be used. But there's a difference between honest and honorable conservative jurisprudence on the one hand and outright provocation on the other. And I hope the president chooses someone that even Democrats will grudgingly admit is a sound, solid, and sensible choice.
And do you expect that sense of bipartisanship in this process from the senators who ultimately have to make this decision, Democrats and Republicans alike?
I do not. But it will affect the tone of the deliberations. And I think at the end of the day, very few Democrats will end up voting for the president's nominee, whoever that nominee is, in part as payback for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's refusal to allow the nomination of Merrick Garland to come to the floor of the Senate for an up or down vote in 2016. Democrats are still smarting from that, and I don't think that they're going to let this nominee slide through easily.
This is Elaine, and Elaine is from Washington State, Democrats line. Hi.
Hi. You said that you knew for a fact, and so I'd like to bring up some facts about this, incompetent Congress that we have. Since January 17th, 2017, they have passed 1,049 bills. That's Congress. But the Senate is sitting on 340 bills. So if anybody is not effective, it would seem to me that that would be the Senate and not the Congress. So to put the blame on the Congress is ludicrous to me. That's just my thought about it.
Well, I'm sure your numbers are correct, but this is where we have to get behind the numbers. I would bet that almost all of those bills have been passed with Republican support and no Democratic support. I would bet that most of those bills are bills where the minority party has had almost no opportunity to offer amendments. Now, when bills like that get to the Senate, which requires more bipartisanship in order to do most legislation, they're not going to go anywhere. So the Speaker of the House can say, well, we're marvelously productive because we're cranking out legislation like sausages. And so you are. You're cranking out bills like sausages. They're going to be dead on arrival in the Senate. There's a reason why the Senate isn't moving on the House's bills, because the Senate can't move on the House's bills as long as the House passes bills with the support of the majority only, which is why it is so important to create a new dynamic in the House of Representatives, such that when the House actually passes a bill and sends it over to the Senate has something to work with.
From Wilson, North Carolina, Independent Line, Timothy, hi.
Hi. Yes, good morning. I have a suggestion, comment, and a quick question. And Pedro, please don't cut me off like you always do. Thank you very much. But I like the foundation you have as far as labels. I think C-SPAN, well, number one, I got a suggestion for C-SPAN. Instead of having the Democrat, Republican, and Independent, why don't you just have the people to call in? When you call in as labels as a Democrat or Republican, automatically people get mad and angry and they complain all the time. And you can just have people call in.
Okay, caller, since you're on with the guest, go ahead and direct your question or comment to the guest, please.
Okay, please. Thank you. Okay, now, the Constitution. Until we're willing to change the Constitution, nothing is going to get done. Example is the Electoral College. The two worst presidents that we had, George Bush and Donald Trump, lost by millions of votes on the Electoral College, and they didn't. The majority of the people didn't vote for him, rather. And look what happened with George Bush.
Okay, thank you, caller.
Well, sir, you're not alone in wondering whether the Electoral College has outlived its useful purpose, whatever that might have been. I think it's going to take a very long time for the people who are in favor of changing or abolishing it to get their way. There are some interim proposals that I think would make a difference for those who want to move things in that direction. For example, there's a national movement to get a majority of states to commit to one another to cast their electoral votes in line with the popular vote. And if that were ever to achieve critical mass, then that could make a big difference without a constitutional amendment. Abolishing the Electoral College would be a constitutional earthquake, and constitutional earthquakes have happened, but usually in the wake of wars.
Bill Galston, one of those suggestions that you make when it comes to the project is a 5-day work week. Has the Congress ever seen a 5-day work week, a solid 5 days?
Well, you know, back in the old days before the invention of jet airplanes, when members of Congress couldn't fly in on Monday night and fly out on Thursday night, yeah, we did. Now, granted, the other terrible invention, namely air conditioning, drove Congress out of Washington for most of the summer. But what we have now is a Congress that sort of staggers along 12 months out of the year, but the work week is very short. The House and the Senate do not coordinate their schedules. And so a lot of business isn't getting done because it's so inefficient. We have a very simple proposal. 3 weeks on, 1 week off. We understand that senators and members of Congress have to do a lot of work back home and hold town halls with their folks. What about 3 5-day work weeks? And then you get a week off to do your town halls, you do your constituent service, you raise money locally or whatever else you want to do. Wouldn't that be much more sensible? What we're doing now is crazy.
One more call, and this is from California. Republican line, Jerome.
Good morning, Pedro. Good morning, Mr. Galston. I was currently a write-in candidate for the Assembly District 1 position in California, and what my premise has been to treat the current congressional people as employees. Anybody that is on the what I call the potential employee list, i.e. the ballot, would be treated just as that, as an employee. They would then have to come to the people to ensure that they're interviewing for a job and not for a long-term position. I'm totally against term limits. I think that the people have the ability to have term limits. They just have to get up off their butts and to enforce those term limits. And that's what I'm about. I'm about having a different perception about how we look at our government. Not how they look at us, but how we look at them.
Okay.
And that's what...
Caller, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of common sense to the idea that running for office is a job interview. I agree with you. And now, different people will have different views of the best qualifications for the office. And that's democracy. But I think that your basic perspective is very sensible, and I'm sure most people would agree with it once you have a chance to explain it to them.
The group is No Labels. The project is the Speaker Project. Bill Galston here to talk about it. Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you, Pedro. Pleasure as always.
Coming up, we're going to talk about those Supreme Court nominations with Daily Beast senior contributor Matt Lewis to talk about what he sees as the fight ahead in the confirmation of a next Supreme Court justice. That conversation coming up on Washington Journal.
The C-SPAN